Hello, this video is going to look at the OCR comparative Gothic question. We're going to look at how we can maximize the marks in our comparative paragraphs, looking at the Gothic text Dracula and the Bloody Chamber. We're taking paragraphs from a previous student, Orley, who got an A star in English literature and then went on to study at Oxford. Okay, here's the question. Female victimhood is an important element in Gothic writing. Consider how far you agree with this statement by comparing Dracula with the Bloody Chamber. So the question's asking specifically for comparisons, contrasts, how far you agree with something naturally suggests it's asking you to disagree with it, or in what ways you might agree, in what ways you might disagree. Take a few moments to think about how you would plan an answer to this question first before we move on. Okay, so you're given some ideas to how you would plan this answer. This is how Orley planned out the answer to her question. Each of the bullet points is perhaps a different area that she would explore. We try and encourage students to have at least 4 different areas that they would explore in this essay. If you can come up with more, all the better. You're not expected to talk about everything in every paragraph. Okay, so you think about it. So we're going to focus on one of these areas that Orley's explored. And so we're going to choose the this first area here, how women are presented as victims, or how they're not presented as victims. So this is the area that we're going to explore in our paragraph writing. Okay, each area that you look at must have a really clear topic sentence like this one here. Women are presented as victims by both Carter and Stoker. You don't give any examples in this. You just set out your clear area of discussion. For the purposes of this video, quotes are highlighted in yellow and critical contexts to explain are highlighted in green. Okay, so what we can see from this opening paragraph is that we're just focusing on the character of Mina, and that's perfectly fine. Orley might talk about other characters in other paragraphs, but we're seeing how she's seen as a victim through the quotes being forced face down on his bosom. A focus perhaps on the language here with looking at the verbs forcing and seizing. And then we see that Orley goes on to talk about how Mina sees herself as unclean, again, morally unclean, a mark of shame. So we've got, quite a few quotes in this section. She's ranging around it. She's not looking at other characters. Instead, she's focusing just on one character at this time and taking a few quotes from her to show her victimhood. Now, here, Orley brings in a critic, Nina Auerbach, to relate Mina's experience to that perhaps of the anxieties of late 19th century Britain and the influx of immigrants. And she sees Mina as in some way representing the innocence of Britain being tainted or perceived to be tainted by these dangerous foreigners. So we've got a nice, interesting contextual element here. And she goes further than just saying the anxieties of immigrants. She highlights which possible immigrants they might be, the influx of European Jews. Why were they fleeing? Because of the pogroms. So we see there's a kind of a level of detail in a sentence rather than just saying immigration. I suppose history students should be careful of over historicizing their essay, but here it's done in a nice, neat sentence, giving some contextual detail. Always look for offering more information than just one quote before moving on to your comparisons. So examiners like to see words like furthermore, additionally, so that you're offering other evidence before you go into your comparison. Too many people use one quote and then compare with their second text. So here, Orley goes on to talk about Mina's sense of in her being morally unclean. A lot of what Mina talks about is, in a sense, she's ungodly with this act. She sees it in religious or moral terms. Now, Orley brings in the reader's context. The Victorian audience would clearly see the religious connotations of Mina's mark. They would make the allusion with the mark of Cain. And so they would see Mina as a victim of sin. So Orley's bringing in a sort of religious context here. She's bringing in the context of the reader at the time, having an awareness of how Stoker might be presenting this in a kind of religious sense. Okay, this is the second paragraph. Now, why two paragraphs? You can do it as one paragraph, but it's probably a matter of taste. If the paragraph starts to get too long, then it's okay to break it up. But it's really important that your next paragraph is being seen to be comparative, that it's referring back to that paragraph that you've just dealt with. So in contrast, Carter's heroine in the bloody chamber, though still a victim, does not remain this way. So the topic sentence is still focusing for the reader what we're looking at. We've got lots of comparative phrases or words here to highlight to the examiner that the two texts are being dealt with together, even though this is a second paragraph. So in contrast, similarly, unlike Stoker, Carter appears to be doing this. Whereas Stoker victimizes Mina through Dracula, Carter argues the opposite. So we're seeing a very comparative paragraph here. Here the structure seems fairly logical. Orley is starting by, drawing out comparisons that the girl in the bloody chamber is seen as a victim of her husband in many ways, and she focuses on, these very violent verbs of impaled, suggesting that she's a passive victim, rather like Mina. However, there's a difference. The wiser, older narrator telling the story admits, I sense myself a potentiality for corruption. So here we've got a kind of difference in the characters where Mina sees herself as, as unclean. This girl's much more aware of her own desires. She admits to feeling reborn. Notice the use of embedded quotes here that don't have to be very long, but give the examiner the sense of a really assured grasp of the text. Her mark cannot be removed. So we've got a comparison here that then leads to a contrast. Unlike Stoker, who appears to claim that women can be prevented from becoming victims, Carter appears to signify that the scars of patriarchal rule are permanent, but suggests that women should liberate themselves. So she's drawing out distinctions between what Carter does with women and what Stoker does with women. And then she brings in, as we can see in the green here, she brings in contextual information to explain that. Contexts are worth 50% of your answer, so they have to be used to explain why the writer writes the way they write. So context cannot just be there on their own. They have to in some way explain how the text is interpreted or understood, or how the text has been shaped or influenced in its writing and production. So Carter is a second wave feminist. What's interesting about this is that a very simple answer would be Carter is a feminist writer and just leave it there. But what the examiner sees from this contextual information here are three things. A sense that the writer has really understood the context of Carter. She's one kind of feminist and ardent feminist, but she's not an orthodox one. She's not what one might consider a typical feminist. And then she goes on to explain in what ways that might be. She also references her biographer, again, hinting to the examiner that this student has got a wealth of contextual information beyond what she's merely writing. And this allows her to draw interesting comparisons. Whereas Stoker victimizes Mina through Dracula's sadomasochism, Carter argues the opposite. And so she then makes reference here to, at the end of the story, how she's subverted the ending of the Bluebeard story. So referencing the Bluebeard original would also be context. But context has to be used to explain. Carter subverts fairy stories. She plays with fairy stories. She chooses these fairy stories precisely because they offer young children unrealistic presentations of females and victimhood, arguably is what Carter's suggesting. Instead, she shows us more complex characters like the girl in the company of wolves, who is fully aware of her own powers and knew she was nobody's piece of meat. So the paragraph ends with a very brief reference to another character in another text. Orley doesn't have to explain what goes on in that story. She may well explore that story in another paragraph, but by ending on a quote, she's touching on or illustrating the contrast between Stoker and Carter. So, what are the strengths in this? This is a wide-ranging, detailed exploration of comparison and contrast that uses quotes economically. One-word quotes: reborn, impaled. Correct terminology, not just talking about the word, but the verb. Allusions have been referred to. Various contexts, the biographical context, what people have said about Carter, but also the context of fairy stories. In our previous paragraph, we've looked at the context of the reader and how meanings in text change over time and how readers change over time, and how a Victorian audience would perhaps see the religious aspect perhaps more than the modern audience. This is an assured piece of work in which the student is ranging around the text, but isn't always focused on retelling us the story of what happens in the story. There's no reference to what happens in the Company of Wolves, but merely it's used as an illustrative example of how Carter adapts fairy stories or changes them to make the point about the topic sentence. How are women portrayed as victims or not? Finally, remember the 25% of this question is going on comparisons and contrasts. Orley's not just looking for similarities, but she's looking for how there's subtle distinctions and major distinctions between texts. And there isn't a jump to the second text until the first text has been dealt with in some level of detail, but only dealt with in the sense of proving the topic sentence at the start. You can't talk about everything all of the time. You've got to decide what you're going to talk about and be economical in how you talk about it. I hope this video has helped give you some idea of how to maximize your marks in the comparative Gothic essay for OCR.